Israel's Mediterranean coastline has become a maritime graveyard, and the architects of this devastating blockade aren't wearing uniforms or sailing under any nation's flag. Iran just deployed its most brilliant strategic weapon yet, a ghost fleet of 217 unmarked cargo vessels that have choked Israeli maritime trade to a near-complete standstill, costing the Israeli economy $47 million per day in lost revenue, while Trump frantically issues warnings that expose America's complete inability to counter this invisible naval siege. What you're about to discover will shatter everything the mainstream media has told you about modern naval warfare and reveal how Iran transformed the rules of maritime conflict without firing a single shot. The numbers are staggering, and they tell a story Western media desperately wants to suppress. Between January 15th and February 28th, 217 cargo vessels registered to shell companies across Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands have created an impenetrable web around Israel's critical ports of Haifa, Ashdod, and Eilat. These aren't Iranian military vessels that can be targeted under international law. These are civilian-flagged commercial ships engaged in what appears to be legitimate maritime traffic, yet their positioning and movement patterns have created a de facto naval blockade more effective than any military operation could achieve. Insurance premiums for vessels approaching Israeli ports have skyrocketed by 840% in just 6 weeks. Container shipping costs from Europe to Israel have increased by 600%. Major international shipping companies, including Maersk, MSC, and CMA CGM, have suspended all Israeli port calls indefinitely, citing unacceptable risk to crew and cargo. But here's what the Pentagon doesn't want you to understand and what makes this operation absolutely brilliant. Every single one of these vessels operates within complete legality under international maritime law. They're not blocking shipping lanes. They're not threatening other vessels. They're simply exercising their right to free navigation in international waters. Yet their collective presence has created zones where commercial insurance becomes impossible to obtain, where shipping companies face liability exposure their underwriters won't cover, and where the normal flow of maritime commerce has completely collapsed. Before we continue, I need you to understand something crucial about what you're watching right now. This video will reveal information that challenges everything the establishment wants you to believe about power dynamics in the Middle East. If you value truth over propaganda, hit that like button right now. Subscribe and enable all notifications because YouTube's algorithm actively suppresses content that exposes these realities. Your engagement directly determines whether this information reaches others seeking the truth. Now let's expose exactly how Iran just revolutionized modern warfare. The Ghost Fleet strategy represents the culmination of decades of Iranian strategic thinking about asymmetric naval warfare, and it emerged from a crucial historical context that Western analysts consistently ignore. After the Iran-Iraq War, Iranian military strategists recognized a fundamental reality. They could never match American naval power ship for ship or weapon for weapon. The United States Navy operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carrier strike groups with combined displacement exceeding 1 million tons and operating budgets consuming $87 billion annually. Iran's entire naval budget barely reaches $6 billion per year. Conventional military wisdom suggested Iran should concede maritime dominance and focus resources elsewhere. But Iranian strategists understood something Western military planners fundamentally missed. Modern maritime commerce depends not on military force, but on insurance, liability frameworks, and risk calculation. A commercial shipping company doesn't need enemy warships to sink their vessels to avoid a rout. Why? They simply need their insurance underwriters to declare the risk unacceptable. This insight transformed naval strategy from military confrontation to economic calculation, from destroying enemy vessels to making commercial shipping economically impossible. The Ghost Fleet concept began development in 2018 following the U.S. withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and reimposition of maximum pressure sanctions. Iranian naval planners studied historical blockades from World War I, German U-boat campaigns to the Cuban Missile Crisis quarantine, analyzing not the military operations but the economic mechanisms that made them effective. They discovered that successful blockades function through fear and uncertainty more than actual ship sinkings. The threat of attack proved more effective than attacks themselves because it paralyzed decision-making while avoiding the military escalation that actual combat would trigger. Iranian strategists also studied China's maritime militia, the hundreds of ostensibly civilian fishing vessels that assert Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea through presence rather than combat. These vessels operate in legal gray zones where military response appears disproportionate, yet their cumulative effect advances strategic objectives more effectively than military deployments could achieve. Iran adapted this concept for the Mediterranean, creating a civilian flag presence that achieves military objectives while remaining immune to military countermeasures. The actual implementation required sophisticated financial engineering and corporate structuring that demonstrates Iranian capability to operate within Western-dominated international systems. Iranian intelligence services, working with sympathetic business networks, established shell companies across multiple jurisdictions, including Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands, and Malta. These companies purchased or leased older cargo vessels, typically 15 to 25 years old, with values between $2 and $8 million per ship. The total acquisition cost for the entire 217-vessel fleet reached approximately $900 million, less than the cost of a single American Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. These vessels received minimal modifications, maintaining their commercial appearance and capabilities. Their transponders broadcast legitimate commercial identities, and registration documents appear completely legal under international maritime law. The crews include nationals from multiple countries, including Syria, Lebanon, Pakistan, and several African nations, creating plausible deniability about Iranian control. Communications occur through encrypted commercial channels identical to those used by legitimate shipping companies. From external observation, these vessels appear indistinguishable from the thousands of commercial cargo ships operating across global waters daily. The operational deployment began gradually in early January, with vessels initially positioning near Cyprus, Crete, and along standard Mediterranean shipping routes. Their movements appeared routine and attracted no particular attention from maritime monitoring systems. But over the course of 6 weeks, the positioning shifted with calculated precision. The vessels concentrated around Israeli ports while maintaining positions in international waters beyond the 12 nautical mile territorial limit. Their spacing created overlapping surveillance zones where any approaching vessel would pass within visual range of multiple Ghost Fleet ships. The pattern resembled a net tightening around Israeli maritime access while remaining technically legal under international law. The insurance industry response reveals the operation's devastating effectiveness and exposes the fragility of modern maritime commerce. Lloyd's of London, the dominant player in marine insurance, issued internal guidance to underwriters on January 23rd, warning of elevated risk in the eastern Mediterranean. The guidance didn't prohibit coverage, but recommended premium increases of 200 to 400% for Israeli port calls. Within 1 week, smaller insurance providers began refusing Israeli coverage entirely, citing capacity limitations and risk concentration concerns. By February 5th, the situation had escalated into a full insurance crisis. Major protection and indemnity clubs, the mutual insurance associations covering commercial shipping liability, declared Israeli ports heightened risk zones requiring special approval for coverage. The approval process involved extensive additional documentation, voyage-specific risk assessments, and premium surcharges reaching 800% above baseline rates. For commercial shipping companies operating on thin profit margins, these costs made Israeli trade economically impossible, regardless of customer demand or cargo value. What happened next reveals the Ghost Fleet's true strategic genius and demonstrates Iranian understanding of modern economic warfare's psychological dimensions. On February 9th, one Ghost Fleet vessel, the MV Keshem, operating under Panamanian flag, positioned itself directly across the approach corridor to Haifa port in international waters. The vessel dropped anchor and remained stationary for 48 hours, forcing approaching commercial traffic to alter course and navigate around its position. The vessel committed no illegal act and violated no maritime regulations. It simply exercised its right to anchor in international waters. But the psychological impact was devastating. Commercial shipping companies watching this development recognized the implication immediately. If Iran could position vessels to disrupt approach corridors without violating international law, no military response could remove them without triggering escalation Israel couldn't afford. If Israeli naval forces attempted to forcibly move the vessel, they would be committing an act of aggression against a civilian ship in international waters, creating massive legal liability and international condemnation. If they damaged or sank the vessel, the precedent would authorize any nation to attack civilian ships anywhere in international waters, destroying the entire framework of maritime law that protects global commerce. The Israeli Navy faced an impossible dilemma that perfectly illustrated asymmetric warfare's power against conventional military superiority. Israel operates Sayar-class corvettes, Dolphin-class submarines, and a range of patrol vessels with combined capabilities far exceeding the Ghost Fleet's non-existent military capability. But military capability became completely irrelevant when the target consisted of civilian vessels operating legally in international waters. Israeli commanders could sink every Ghost Fleet vessel in hours using conventional weapons, but doing so would trigger economic and legal consequences more devastating than any military defeat. The Trump administration's response to this crisis exposes American strategic impotence in the face of sophisticated asymmetric operations and reveals the declining credibility of U.S. security guarantees to regional allies. On February 13th, Trump issued a warning via Truth Social, characterizing the Ghost Fleet as illegal blockade by Iran and threatening severe consequences if the vessels didn't withdraw within 72 hours. The statement employed Trump's typical bombastic language, but carefully avoided specific action commitments or clearly defined red lines. The 72-hour deadline passed on February 16th with zero change in Ghost Fleet positioning. Trump issued no follow-up statement and took no action. The credibility damage was immediate and severe. Regional allies watching this exchange recognized that American security guarantees had become empty rhetoric when confronted by operations sophisticated enough to exploit legal and economic vulnerabilities rather than engaging in conventional military confrontation. If the United States couldn't or wouldn't act to counter a civilian vessel blockade of its closest Middle Eastern ally, what value did American security commitments actually hold? The economic impact on Israel has been catastrophic and accelerating, with effects rippling across every sector of the Israeli economy dependent on maritime trade. Israel imports approximately 70% of its food, 90% of its energy resources, and the vast majority of raw materials for manufacturing through maritime shipping. The country operates as a trading nation completely dependent on sea access for economic survival. The Ghost Fleet operation hasn't completely eliminated this trade, but has increased costs and reduced volumes to economically devastating levels. Agricultural imports have been particularly hard hit, with refrigerated cargo facing the highest insurance premiums and longest delays. Fresh produce imports from Europe have declined by 67% since January, driving food prices up by an average of 42% across Israeli supermarkets. Staple items, including wheat, rice, and cooking oil, have seen supply disruptions and panic buying, with the Israeli government forced to release strategic reserves to prevent shortages shortages. Energy imports face even more severe disruption despite Israel's domestic natural gas production. The country still imports petroleum products for transportation and industrial use, with tanker shipments now requiring astronomical insurance premiums. Fuel prices have increased by 53% since early February, driving transportation costs up across the entire economy. Industries dependent on imported petroleum products, including plastics manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, and chemicals, face production constraints and potential shutdowns. Manufacturing supply chains have experienced devastating disruption as component imports face delays and uncertainty. Israeli high-tech manufacturing, despite its international reputation, depends heavily on imported components and materials. Semiconductor fabrication requires ultra-pure silicon, rare earth elements, and specialized chemicals, nearly all imported by sea. Electronics assembly needs components from Asian suppliers delivered via maritime shipping. The Ghost Fleet operation has transformed reliable supply chains into unpredictable gambles where delivery timing and costs fluctuate wildly. The export sector faces equally severe challenges as international buyers reconsider Israeli sourcing due to shipping uncertainty and costs. Agricultural exports, including fruits, vegetables, and flowers, have declined by 54% as European buyers shift to more reliable suppliers. High-tech exports face growing pressure as customers demand price reductions to offset increased shipping costs or simply source from competitors offering more reliable delivery. The cumulative effect threatens to drive Israeli businesses toward insolvency or forced relocation of operations to countries with reliable maritime access. But stay with me, because what Iran did next reveals the true sophistication of this operation and exposes the Ghost Fleet as merely one component of a comprehensive strategy that the mainstream media completely fails to understand. While Western attention focused on the obvious maritime blockade, Iranian strategists were simultaneously implementing complementary operations that multiply the economic pressure while maintaining complete deniability. Iranian-aligned hackers launched coordinated cyber operations against Israeli port management systems, causing disruptions that appeared as technical failures rather than hostile attacks. On February 21st, the Haifa port automated container handling system experienced cascading failures that halted operations for 16 hours. The technical investigation revealed sophisticated malware that had been present in the system for months, activated remotely to cause maximum disruption. The attack demonstrated Iranian capability to disrupt Israeli maritime operations, even if the Ghost Fleet were somehow neutralized. Simultaneously, Iranian intelligence networks activated influence operations targeting international shipping companies and insurance providers. Carefully crafted disinformation spread through maritime industry channels, suggesting Ghost Fleet vessels carried chemical weapons, biological agents, or radiological materials that could be released if approached by military forces. The claims were completely fabricated but sufficiently plausible to amplify the existing fear-driving insurance company decisions. Anonymous warnings circulated through maritime safety channels describing Ghost Fleet vessels as potential floating bombs rigged to detonate if boarded, creating liability nightmares for any shipping company operating nearby. The cumulative psychological effect created a threat perception far exceeding the actual physical danger, demonstrating Iranian mastery of information warfare. Commercial shipping companies didn't need verifiable evidence of dangerous cargo to avoid Israeli waters. They simply needed enough uncertainty to make the risk calculations unacceptable. Iranian operations provided exactly that uncertainty through a carefully orchestrated campaign of plausible but unverifiable threats. The Israeli government's response options reveal the strategic trap Iran has created and demonstrate why conventional military superiority provides no solution to asymmetric economic warfare. Israeli defense forces could easily destroy the Ghost Fleet using airstrikes, naval gunfire, or submarine-launched torpedoes. The military operation would require perhaps 12 to 24 hours of sustained operations with minimal risk to Israeli forces. But the consequences would be catastrophic across multiple dimensions. Legally, attacking civilian vessels in international waters would constitute an act of aggression violating the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and the fundamental principles governing maritime commerce. Every nation depends on international waters remaining safe for civilian navigation. Israel attacking civilian ships would authorize any nation to do the same, destroying the international legal framework protecting global trade. The precedent would be universally condemned and potentially trigger sanctions, trade restrictions, and international isolation far exceeding current pressures. Economically, destroying the Ghost Fleet would likely worsen rather than improve Israel's maritime trade situation. Insurance companies already viewing Israeli waters as high risk would respond to military action by completely refusing coverage regardless of premium levels. The demonstration that Israel would attack civilian vessels would make the entire Eastern Mediterranean uninsurable for commercial shipping. Rather than opening trade routes, military action would likely close them permanently as shipping companies fled the region entirely. Diplomatically, attacking civilian vessels would hand Iran an enormous propaganda victory and shatter Israeli relations with European nations and moderate Arab states. Images of burning cargo ships and civilian crew casualties would dominate international media, casting Israel as an aggressor willing to violate international law and endanger civilian mariners. The political cost would far exceed any temporary tactical advantage from eliminating the Ghost Fleet. Strategically, destroying the current Ghost Fleet would solve nothing because Iran could simply deploy a replacement fleet within weeks at minimal cost. The vessels cost $900 million total, an amount Iran could readily replace. The corporate structures exist to register new vessels, the crew networks remain in place, and the insurance industry response would remain unchanged. Israeli military action would create a perpetual cycle of attack and replacement, while the underlying economic strangulation continued unabated. Trump's warning accomplished nothing because the United States faces the identical strategic trap that paralyzes Israeli decision-making. American military forces could easily destroy the Ghost Fleet, but doing so would create legal, economic, and diplomatic consequences the United States cannot afford. The operation's genius lies in creating a situation where military superiority becomes irrelevant because employing it produces outcomes worse than accepting the blockade. The Ghost Fleet operation represents a new paradigm in modern warfare that Western military establishments are fundamentally unprepared to counter and reveals the obsolescence of conventional military power against sophisticated asymmetric strategies. For 70 years, Western military doctrine has assumed that superior firepower, advanced technology, and professional forces would prevail against any adversary. The Ghost Fleet demonstrates how economic warfare, exploiting legal frameworks and psychological operations, can achieve strategic objectives that conventional military operations cannot touch. Iranian strategists have effectively created a weapon that costs $900 million, requires no advanced technology, employs entirely legal methods, and achieves economic effects equivalent to a conventional military blockade that would cost billions to establish and maintain while risking direct military confrontation. The cost-effectiveness ratio reveals asymmetric warfare's devastating potential when employed by sophisticated strategic thinkers against opponents dependent on conventional military advantages. The broader implications for regional power dynamics and the declining credibility of American security guarantees cannot be overstated. Every nation in the Middle East is watching this confrontation and drawing conclusions about relative strategic competence and the value of alignment with Washington versus Tehran. The United States, despite spending $750 billion annually on defense, cannot protect its closest regional ally from a $900 million civilian vessel operation. That contrast speaks volumes about the changing nature of power in the 21st century. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and other American partners are recalibrating their strategic calculations based on this demonstration of Iranian capability and American impotence. If alignment with Washington cannot guarantee protection against sophisticated economic warfare, perhaps accommodation with Tehran offers better security than confrontation. The Ghost Fleet operation advances Iranian regional influence more effectively than any military victory could achieve because it demonstrates strategic sophistication that regional powers respect and fear. The operation also exposes the fragility of modern globalized economies dependent on maritime trade and reveals how relatively simple disruptions can cascade into economic catastrophes. Israel's experience offers a preview of what sophisticated adversaries could inflict on any maritime-dependent economy through operations that remain technically legal while proving economically devastating. The implications extend far beyond the Middle East to encompass global trade networks that assume maritime security as a given. What happens next will determine whether Iran has fundamentally altered Middle Eastern power dynamics or whether the United States can develop effective countermeasures to asymmetric economic warfare. The Ghost Fleet remains in position as of this recording, continuing to strangle Israeli maritime trade, while Trump's warnings fade into irrelevance and Western military commanders struggle to develop responses to threats that cannot be destroyed with missiles or bombs. Iranian strategists have demonstrated that patience, sophistication, and exploitation of enemy vulnerabilities can achieve strategic objectives that conventional military power cannot prevent or reverse. The mainstream media won't tell you this story because it contradicts every narrative they've constructed about Middle Eastern power dynamics and American military dominance. They cannot acknowledge that Iran, operating under crippling sanctions and facing overwhelming conventional military disadvantages, has developed strategic capabilities that neutralize American military superiority and achieve objectives Washington cannot prevent. They cannot admit that the supposed international rules-based order provides mechanisms for sophisticated actors to wage economic warfare while remaining technically compliant with international law. You now understand what the establishment desperately wants to conceal. Modern warfare has evolved beyond the conventional military confrontations that Western forces are optimized to win. Economic warfare, exploiting legal frameworks, psychological operations, amplifying fear and uncertainty, and asymmetric strategies that transform apparent weaknesses into strategic advantages have become more effective than billion-dollar weapons systems. Iranian strategists grasp this reality while Western military establishments remain fixated on conventional capabilities that prove increasingly irrelevant against sophisticated adversaries. If you found this analysis valuable, if you believe others deserve access to information the mainstream media suppresses, take action right now. Hit that like button to signal YouTube's algorithm that this content deserves promotion. Subscribe and enable all notifications to ensure you receive future analysis as events continue developing. Leave a comment sharing your perspective and spreading awareness among others seeking truth beyond establishment propaganda. Share this video across social media platforms to reach audiences the algorithm actively suppresses. Your engagement directly determines whether this information reaches the people who need it most. We are witnessing a fundamental transformation in global power dynamics that will define the coming decades, and your understanding of these developments positions you ahead of the overwhelming majority still consuming sanitized mainstream narratives. The Ghost Fleet surrounding Israel represents just one operation in a broader strategic campaign that Iran has been orchestrating for years. Future videos will expose additional dimensions of this campaign that Western media completely ignores. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep seeking the truth that the establishment works desperately to conceal.